This is WCM's Park Update, a weekly show covering the outdoor hospitality industry, hosted by Ben Quiggle and Mike Gast. During each episode, you'll hear from special guests and campground experts on topics that will help your park flourish. WCM's Park Update is a production of Woodall's Campground Magazine.
Hi, I'm Ben Quiggle, editor of Woodall's Campground Magazine, and this is another episode of WCM's Park Update, sponsored by New Book, Reservation System, and my co-host, of course, is here, Mike Gast, former Vice President of Communications at Campgrounds of America. And our guest today is Patrick Hardy, who is the CEO and founder of Hytropy. And Hytropy is a disaster. You kind of do like disaster planning for like RV parks, campgrounds. You do a bunch of different industries, right?
Yeah, that's right, Ben. I work in 57 industry verticals. So I work with restaurants and bars and nursing homes and charter schools and alligator farms and RV parks and campgrounds and modular communities. You know, all kinds of different kinds. I work with scuba companies. I mean, all kinds of businesses.
We have to back up. You said alligator farms. So like, that must be a unique challenge there, you know, when they have issues. So
that looks like a disaster waiting to happen. That's a lot of YouTube videos.
Yeah, it is. As a matter of fact, on Monday I'm actually going to be visiting one in Georgia. It's really unique because whenever you are working with exotic animals, that's obviously a unique challenge when you're thinking about evacuations and everything else, because they are highly uncontrolled. Their behaviors are uncontrolled. So you have to use a lot of sort of more engineering to make sure that they're not biting people, because you can't rationalize with them, generally speaking. So it's and they're obviously extremely dangerous animals for obvious reasons.
With that many different industries, Patrick, does that mean a disaster is a disaster is a disaster? I mean, that there's some basic things that just are common to all disasters.
I tell my clients all the time, if it's a disaster to you, it's a disaster to me. So I've had all kinds of things. Matter of fact, once I was doing a charter school in the state of Alabama, and they had a tree that fell about a quarter of a mile away from the school. And what happened was, it didn't seem like it was a big deal in and of itself until they realized that there was a very, very large hive of Africanized bees in the hives that were knocked over. So the entire school goes into a lockdown, complete lockdown, totally. And what was the lockdown for? Because the bees were swarming and they were looking for people to sting. I mean, it literally was that bad. There were bees covering the doorknobs and the doors and the windows. It was pretty scary for them. So what I tell companies is, if it's something that disrupts your operations in some way, if that's what it does, if it's a disruptive to your operations, then as far as I'm concerned, that's a disaster. Because that really is what definitions of disasters are. They are incidences that force you to have to significantly modify how you operate on a day-to-day basis, whether you are evacuating, sheltering in place, or locking down.
And I think that's kind of interesting because, you know, when I hear disaster, I'm thinking like major things like wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, you know, all the major things. But I think what you just said kind of resonates a little bit. You know, it's things that maybe, you know, like that tree and the bees, you know, it didn't sound like a big deal, but it turned into a big one. So it's not just like these major disasters that we see in the news. It can be smaller, more localized events too, I guess, that just impact your business.
I was working with a campground in San Diego, because you're absolutely right. And what happened was that they had a guest who had gotten rip-roaringly drunk, 2 o'clock in the morning. So he'd been drinking beers, from what I understood. He was drinking beers all afternoon, all evening, and 2 o'clock in the morning he decided, for some reason, to strip himself entirely naked. So he was completely naked. And so he was walking around the campground. No one knew, no one saw him, and he fell into a pond. And he fell to the bottom of the pond, and he got caught up in some roots, and he drowned. Now, no one saw him enter the pond, but some of his relatives, who realized he hadn't contacted them in a while, decided to call the campground and ask what happened to him. They went to his They went to his RV and realized that the door was left open and he was not in there, and the place looked destroyed because, of course, he'd been drunk and whatever was going on in there, and they couldn't find him. And so the campground, virtually the entire campground was shut down for like 2 to 3 days because the police, the FBI were looking for him because in San Diego, they obviously deal with a lot of cartel activity as a result of organized narcotics. So they thought that it was possible that he had been he'd been either killed by the cartel or he'd been kidnapped by the cartel, and they were looking for him, and the entire campground was shut down. And then lo and behold, someone decided to look in the pond, and there he was, bottom of the pond, naked as the day he was born and naked as the day he died, I guess. So that was, and that's a disaster, right? So that's something that could be very disruptive to, to a property, because it forces you to, you can't deal with guests, you can't do intakes, you can't do anything, and that doesn't even. And Mike, I'm sure you can understand this too. The communications element of it is very critical because it's the optics of it. If you are perceived as a property where people die or where there's criminal activity, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. That's totally irrelevant. If it gets out there that it is suspected that there's gang activity, that can have a massive effect on your attendance.
So we've got a lot of campground owners in this industry that are smaller operations. Do you run into a lot of folks that are just, they haven't thought of it? This is not part of their business operation, the disaster planning. They have nothing in place. They don't have any training in place. Their employees are not in the know. So do you get called in after the fact and to clean up, or is this something that people are starting to realize they got to get in front of?
Well, I'm realizing a shift in the industry. When I first really entered the industry in full, I mean, I actually was already working with outdoor hospitality properties, but when I actually entered in 2017 and going to conferences and associations and speaking, I realized there were a lot of people who thought, this is important, but I don't know where to start, or they would have something very rudimentary. However, after having done this for a while and having attended OHC a few times and having spoken at various state conferences, I think people are starting to get the message that you need to prepare in advance. that is really important. That you do your planning, you do your training, and you attempt to test it. So sometimes, and I find that a lot of people, this actually, I think where I was in 2017 is I think where the glamping industry is right now, which is you have a lot of glamping operators who are brand new to the industry. They've never owned a campground, they've never been involved in outdoor hospitality, they got money from investors or from family, and they decide to open a glamping property. And in going into this, they discover that there are a lot of elements and things they have to do. And some of these people have never even thought of having a disaster plan. So when I would go to the Glamping Association, I'd be speaking. I spoke at their conference a couple of years ago. I got emails from operators going, why in the world would I need something like this? And so you try to explain to them, and then they start understanding that this is really, really important for them too, because some of these glamping properties, and forget glamping, just in general, some of these properties are very remote. I mean, they are so remote that I actually tell them, in effect, no one's coming to help you. I mean, you understand that, right? Because those people go, well, the ambulances are coming, the fire department. No, they're not coming. They're not coming. You're on your own. So they understand that, wow, I really have to start to think about that. That has to be part of my operational culture.
You mentioned
in the glamping world, you've also got a bunch of folks that are customers that are new to the outdoors. Typically, they're inexperienced in the outdoors, probably, which lends themselves to a little bit more of the accidents and the doing things wrong out there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in fact, what you tend to get with glamping is you get a more affluent clientele, but people who do expect full service, even though they are out in the middle of nowhere. That's the reason why glamping exists, is that they expect that high dollar service, even though they are, quote, roughing it. In what you and I think Ben might probably agree with this. A lot of it's a simulated environment, I think, for camp, because for those people who have camped and I've camped for a very long time, and I've gone to campgrounds where you're actually setting up the tent and you're doing the whole thing. That's very different than some of this glamping. So what we do is that when I go to glamping operators, I say one of the things you really have to make sure that you are thinking about is showing them that you have done the planning in advance before they ask you. And it ends up being something that really can give you a competitive advantage, because if they feel like, over and over that they are getting an experience like they would at a traditional hotel. Even if they don't take advantage of it, it doesn't matter. It's the reason why hotels still talk about their pools, even if it's January and it's snowing outside. They still say, "Hey, listen, we've got pool, we have this, we have that," just to be able to show that you have the amenities available. Again, for the most part, you're never going to use your disaster program unless there is obviously an emergency. And for a lot of guests, that won't be when they're on your property. So, but when it does happen, you show them that you've done the preparation in advance, and that is really a part of your professionalism. And that is really encapsulates what I've been trying to do over these last 6 years to say this emergency preparedness needs to be part of your axis of professionalism, of something you say we do this as part of what we do, just as much as we as we worry about the amenities and the zip lines and all the other things that add to the guest experience.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned the communication aspect of it. How do you work that into what you do? I guess, do you do you have your own PR stuff that you do, or do you work with other like public relations people that have experience with crisis communication, I guess?
Both, Ben. When I work with bigger companies, I've worked with some of the largest outdoor conglomerates. I think I work with all top five. Actually, weirdly enough, KOA I haven't done too much work with. Some of the independent KOAs I have, but not with corporate. But some of the other big companies I have with Jellystone and others. And when I do, when we create a crisis communication plan, we work with them very closely. We work with people like you, Mike, and say, okay, this is what we think is going to work best. However, this is your business, and you are the umbrella corporation. You tell us what the ground rules are. You tell us what you will allow, and they'll tell us, we want them to do this, we want them to do this, we want them to do this. And then what we do a lot of times is we'll say, I know you mentioned this. That may not be best practice in our experience, but if you want to do that, that's fine. However, just keep it under advice. Maybe think about that at some point in the future. Maybe think about modifying this and this. I'll give an example. A lot of times I'll go to companies and I'll say, if there's an emergency or a disaster, what would you like the property managers to say about it? And the corporate communications officers a lot of times say, I don't want them saying a word. I don't want them saying anything. You tell them to contact us and we'll handle the messaging entirely. That's fine. And ironically enough, that's actually fine in large disasters. In some of these smaller disasters, the things that occur on property, it tends to have a feeling that you're deferring to someone else, you're trying to cover something up, because they ask, like I spoke to a journalist once who was working working a disaster, and they were trying to talk to the property manager. And the property manager says, well, you need to contact my the headquarters, which is located in this other state. And they said, why? What do they know? I mean, they're just going to ask you, right? I mean, why don't you just tell me right now? And then when they say, well, I can't do that, that's corporate policy, they get suspicious. They think you're trying to cover something up. And so that's why a lot of times I go to corporate officers and I say, I understand the rationale. I work for Fortune 500 businesses. I'm not new. I was a Fortune 500 consultant. My father was too. I've worked for big universities. I get that. However, I think there are things that you can defer to other people. It doesn't mean you have to do every single thing yourself. There are things you can defer to them and say, you are allowed to say this, and this, but for anything else, have them contact us. And I find that is a really good policy, because otherwise reporters think you're just trying to blow them off, especially if they try to call corporate and they say, well, the office is closed or you can't contact anybody, and that's a big deal. Sometimes they'll have emergency cell phone numbers for people like you, Mike, like where they're trying to say, I want to speak to corporate officers, but I can't tell you the number of times where they've called and they've said they either didn't pick up, or their office was out, or they were on vacation. That has happened, and they say, you need to tell us what's going on right now, or else we're going to tell people that you're lying to us. And that hurts the property. So that's like one of the things we do that in collaboration to try to help, so that the communication is streamlined. We want it for everybody. We want it to be as seamless as possible.
I know in my 20 years with KOA, Patrick, I would have loved to have somebody like you at my elbow sometimes. I had to learn on the fly. Coming out of the newspaper business, I was on the other side of that equation, so I knew where the problems were that you just described. And so I had to learn on the fly for those first few years, and I think I got pretty good at it towards the end, but everything you said is correct. And when you've got 500 locations out there that I had to deal with, it got there was always something going on somewhere at some level. and you
Yeah.
couldn't train fast enough to get people comfortable with that. And you're
Right.
right, the first knee-jerk reaction on a local level to anything happening, sometimes it was a horrific thing like a drowning. Sometimes
Yeah.
it was a natural disaster that was of nobody's,
Yeah.
responsibility other than it was coming at them, and they just shut down, and they get that the owner gets scared. They get a shifty look, and they just say, I can't comment,
Yeah.
and it does look bad.
Mhm.
It does appear like something's wrong. It's very hard to get a hold of, and that first little thing about calling corporate, that was always the fallback. If you knew that if they were gonna do that, well, that was at least a holding pattern to go into, to buy a little bit of time to try to get back to them. And one of the things that I think a lot of business owners fall back on is they make that promise. Either them or somebody in their office says, "We'll get back to you," and then they don't. And that was always the death to me, was you've got to follow up with them, even if it's "I'm sorry, I can't comment on that." You've got to get back, because you just can't let it hang.
I agree with you entirely, Mike. And I will tell you, in addition, I'll just kind of, for the benefit of the listeners, I'll just kind of tell you what the best practice is right now in the industry. And you as a news reporter, Mike, I'd be interested to hear from the newspaper business. I'd be interested to hear what you think of this. What we generally say is we say, if you're going to tell them, listen, I can't comment right now, I'll comment later. We say, give them an exact time. Say, listen, I will I will talk with you. Give me 3 hours. So I will talk to you at 6 p.m. local time. And if they're calling, so you just always say local time. I'll talk to you at 6 p.m. local time. And if it's a big enough, and this really is true, I've actually had this where, like, for some reason, a big news outlet like CNN or something calls. It does not. It's rare, but it does happen. We say to them, when do you need this by? Because those
Right.
big ones, like I tend to say, in that situation, the relationship is just not equal. Even though you would think you'd be in control, really, when you're working with big media outlets, and it's an opportunity if you tell them the right things. So really ask them, when do you need this by? When is airtime for you? And then you try to work with them to give them so that you meet their bylines. But also with local media as well. I used to say to them, try to figure out when their when their deadlines are, so that when to get them information, so it gets into the next day's paper or into the next day's, and the feed now is 24 hours a day, right? But even then, you still want to try to give them an exact time, say, at 8 o'clock. And then, Mike, you're absolutely right. If you say 8 o'clock, it's not 8:01. At 8 o'clock, you get on the call with everybody and you say, here's the things I can answer. And even if there's a lot of I don't knows, or you say, I will find out for you, at least you're giving them something. And that's the reason why I always say, try to give a little bit of time, space, so you can try to contact corporate, because there's people just like you, Mike, where they're just, you're a person, you're a job, you're you're doing a million things. And Hurricane Harvey was a really interesting case study in this, because corporate officers we had large swaths of properties affected simultaneously, and every property was saying, call the corporate guy. And the corporate guy is getting inundated with like 50 calls from 50 outlets from every conceivable jurisdiction. So and they just said, I can't answer your questions. And so that's why we try to say, try to devolve it down. That's why I try to talk to corporate communications officers and say, try to devolve it to your managers. And then if there's something that clearly you don't want them talking about, let's figure that out in advance so that we know what the ground rules are, and then we're just filling in the blanks. Here's what happened with this, and that's what we do when we write our plans. We literally say, here are the things that we generally think that you should be talking about. Here are the things you probably should wait to hear from them. And sometimes even in those instances, I've had a couple corporate teams that said, I don't mind them talking about this and this, as long as they don't make promises, and as long as they don't, say something that's contrary to this policy or that policy, or doesn't violate privacies. Then, as far as we're concerned, that's perfectly permissible.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have to take a small break to recognize our sponsor, New Book, and we will be back with Patrick here in a minute.
Calling all campground operators, owners, front desk heroes, say hello to your show sponsor, New Book, your connected hospitality management solution packed with the power to streamline your operations, maximize revenue, increase bookings, and deliver memorable guest experiences. Thanks to its suite of innovative and easy-to-use tools, backed by an expert customer support team cheering you on 24/7. So if you're ready to level up your campground and unlock more opportunities, head to newbook.cloud to start your journey today.
Hi, welcome back to WCM's Park Update, sponsored by New Book, and we are talking with Patrick Hardy, the CEO of High Trophy. And High Trophy is a disaster management firm. We were just talking a little bit about the communications aspect, I guess, and your company provides crisis plans. People can go on your website at reversedisaster.com and look at all the services that you have available. I guess one of the other key ones is the training aspect. And I know you guys do offer some training, I think, to help people with the training of their disaster plan. I guess, do you see a lot of that in the industry where campgrounds are actually sitting down with their employees on an annual basis and going through these plans and even doing like drills and like walking through different scenarios? Do you see a lot of that in the industry?
No. I don't. I don't think I at all. And I will tell you this: when I was a young disaster planner, my father did emergency preparedness, but he did it for information technologies. He was a disaster recovery specialist, so he worked with universities.
Yeah.
So, and he would go to university departments. He'd write this beautiful plan because that was his full-time job. He worked for the Cal States, which is a really large university system. I think it's the largest in the world, I think. Anyway, but he created plans, and he would turn to them and say, I wrote these beautiful plans, and they'd say, sounds good, disaster planning is done. And he would say, not even close. He'd say, if you don't train on this, you wasted your time and I wasted my time in writing it. Because if you don't train on it, what are we doing here? And they would be very skeptical because he'd be in a room full of academics. They would say, we can just do this on the fly. And he'd say, okay, we'll see. And so he would run an annual drill at some point, and he would discover that nobody had any idea how to operate without email or how to operate when their online classrooms were shut down. And it was very, very frustrating. And I will tell you that I think a lot of properties still to this day, I think that they still believe that as long as you just have a plan, like you're fine. Especially this happens in independent properties a lot too. I don't want to just like harp on, corporate properties because that's one thing. But when you're an independent property and there's only like 2 or 3 of you, you really have to train. You really have got to know what you're talking about here because if one person isn't available or 2 people are not available, you're on your own. And I tell that to properties all the time. I say, don't magic wand what you think is going to happen. So, because if you think that you're going to have all these people to come help you, the fire department is going to take over the property, that everything is going to run smoothly, I don't know what you are thinking because that is just not the case at all. I mean, I had a property who told me this once. I really mean this. This was in Santa Barbara County because I was Santa Barbara, California. They were so attuned and it's a very affluent area for obvious reasons, very, very affluent. But they turned to me and said, "Oh, I'm not worried, Patrick. I don't have to train because the fire department will just come in and take over. I mean, they'll help me with the evacuation as long as I kind of get it started. It's fine." And I said to them, even though I'd done many plans in Santa Barbara, I said, "Okay, we'll see." I went to the fire department and I talked to them. And the fire department made it very clear. They said they're not going to be our highest priority. If that's what they were thinking, they need to think again. And so I had the property contact the fire department, and they clearly had a discussion. And at the end of it, the property called and said, "When can we train?" Because suddenly they realized they really were going to be on their own. You're not going to get 50, fire trucks. They're not going to come in and take care of the property on your own. You must evacuate. So when it comes to training, and by the way, I love to train. I love training people. It's one of my favorite things to do. I've done it on many properties because I love talking with people. I love engaging with them. And the way I train is the way I think everyone should train, which is I don't train through like didactic lecture where I say, okay, I'm telling you, you've got to do this, 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 and this. Yeah. What I say to people is I say, here's generally what needs to happen. We need to do, and I have a system I've used it for 20 years. I call it the C3 method, works really well. But I tell them, I say, within that methodology, I want you to tell me how we can make this work because every property is different. The contours are different. You have big properties, small properties, really rural properties, properties near big cities. Every single place is different, and so you operate a little differently. And training is your chance to interface with people. They're sitting there, they're listening, and if you engage with them and you talk with them, I find that training is so much more effective versus as if I'm talking as if I'm their ninth grade algebra teacher.
Do you think some of these people too, because I know you do like step-by-step plans, there's step-by-step responses. Do you think some of these parks too are like, oh, we got this plan, and when a disaster comes, we'll just pull out this binder and we'll flip to the right page and we're just going to go down the steps, I guess. Do you think some of them think they're just going to be able to do that during a disaster too?
I call it the Harry Potter effect. Everyone thinks they can just open up the book and pull out the magic spell, and the magic spell will take care of it. And I told them, I said, the book is not a magic book. It's involved with human fallacies and mistakes and affectations, and there's unique contours to how people behave in disasters, things that we know are true when disasters occur. So therefore, when we look at the plans and when we train people on them, I say we need to actually go through the steps a few times, because one of the major statistics, and one of the things I tell people all the time is my philosophy is there's no such thing as a perfect disaster plan. Ever. There is never a perfect disaster plan. Anyone who says they have a perfect disaster plan has just revealed its first flaw. That's what I actually wrote about this in my book. Is I told people, you have to absolutely look at your plan as a living document, something that you can modify and fix over time. But it's something that you can't ignore, and you think of it as a magic wand. That's why I call it the magic wand effect, because I think that people just open the book and say, well, there it is. I got my beautiful disaster plan. I have it written. That's what I paid for. And I said, no, you paid for guidelines and policies and procedures, but that doesn't mean they're infallible. It means that given what we're dealing with, we need to adapt appropriately so that the steps can work. That's why training is so important, Ben, and that is why drills are important, because if you don't drill, you don't test the thing, how do we know if it even works? You have no idea, right? So that's why training gives us the chance to interact, and the drills say, let's give this a shot. Let's kick the tires and try it out, because if it doesn't work, and by the way, in all my years of doing this, I've been doing this for over 2 decades, I have never, ever once, and I mean this, in my thousands and thousands and thousands of clients, when I was doing this alone or when I was a consultant, never one time did I ever write a disaster plan, do a drill, and say, wow, I didn't have to fix a thing. I didn't have to fix one thing. Every single drill I thought, and then this is a plan I wrote. I wrote this.
Yeah.
And I always say, things I have to fix, because I'm not perfect, and nor would I ever want to try to be. I simply say, let me get as close as I can. These guys know the property well. If I work with them and we drill, I go to them afterwards and say, how can we fix these things? Because that's what I always ask people. How can we fix it? And they always come to me and say, hey, Patrick, I know your policy and procedure says this, but generally speaking, this is how it works. That is incredibly valuable. That is gold for me as a disaster planner, because then I can contour the book better and I can contour the plans better and say, great, that helps you to understand. That's why I tell people, don't buy templates, don't buy pre-made nonsense, because that doesn't help you. If you're not looking at the specific contours of the property, it's simply never going to work.
Yeah, and I think
campgrounds are so unique as far as businesses go, because they've got on a weekend from 500 to 1,000 or more people that you don't know as your customers. Right. They don't know you. They don't know your policies. They don't know what's going to happen if a hurricane or a tornado drops down. And also, where I always got involved was the campground owner would call and say, I've had a tornado drop down, and I've got damage. I've got trees down. He's got operational things to deal with. And at the same time, the media starts coming in. So that was always kind of my role. But it always seems so unique to me that these communities that sprung up of strangers that were out there, cutting firewood, swinging axes, drinking alcohol, in water features. There was all these recipes for disaster that you just kind of had to wait to see what was going to happen. So I always told people, if your disaster is coming, it's out there someplace. You can't be in business for decades without something going wrong. So you've got to have a plan in place to get around the basics. Now, was I listened to? Rarely. And you're always the first phone call when something blows up in their face. But it's I always thought it was just crazy that it's probably the best insurance you can have, the cheapest insurance you could have, to have a trained program in place like that.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And Mike, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I'll tell you this, which is I had a property once who said, well, I just want the same evacuation plan as my campground just down the road. And I say, okay, fine. So I said, just understand we have to modify it. We got to spend some time on the property. And they go, oh, no, you don't have to do that. And so I just said, let me at least visit the property. And they said, okay, fine. So I said, when I came into the gates, there was an extremely steep slope going all the way down to the bottom of this ridge. And I said to them, and I literally stopped my car at the bottom of the ridge, and I went to the property owner, and I said, I don't have to go any farther into the property. I already found one of your biggest flaws in your evacuation plan, which is the plan that for the other property down the street. It says that we can have a line of campers going out the gate. You can't do that because people can't sit on a hill. I mean, literally, people are going to slide backwards, and then you imagine the mess it's going to be causing, right? So people are, they're always towing car. There you have a car being towed behind, and so I said, you have to make sure it's uniquely contoured. And what you brought up, Mike, I think is really great to know and for people to understand, which is recovery is huge. And one of the things that I universally before I got in the industry, I never found this to be true, which is people planning for recovery. They don't plan for how to get back into business. And you have to do that. Because when you have a disruption to the property, how do you deal with insurance? It's not as simple as calling the insurance company and they're not going to just hand you a check. I mean, it doesn't work like that. Getting people to come out and restore the property, these are all big deals. So you're right. There's a lot of things I think people have to think about in those elements and those parts as well.
Yeah.
And it's coming. Your disaster's on its way.
Oh, yes.
If it hasn't happened to you yet, it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's incredible what's been going on the disaster front here recently. So, and I like the analogy we use for soccer. I'm a soccer coach. We always try to tell the kids, practice it so that when a disaster comes, like when you're in the game, you don't have to think about it. I think it's the same thing. You practice it, and for when a disaster occurs, some of the little smaller things you just don't have to think about. You already know, and it takes kind of the stress out of a very stressful situation. So.
I mean, how can you be a campground owner in Oklahoma and not have a evacuation plan for a tornado? I mean, you're out there.
Or a tornado shelter. I see a lot of parks are adding tornado shelters, which is good, or some sort of shelter building. But to me, it always amazes me in some of these states with tornadoes, they don't have a very good tornado plan in place. So,
well, and I don't know how much time we have left, but I do want to mention one other thing before that, which is one of the things, and for those of you who are listening who own properties, I hear this all the time. Well, I have a lot of equipment. I've got this, I have that. That will take care of me during a disaster. That's how I know it's going to be fine. I tell people, it's never going to be fine. I mean, I can tell you the number of times when equipment doesn't work, and when you rely too much on stuff and not people, that is when you run into very serious problems, because the stuff isn't going to be responsible for evacuating people. It's not just the flashlights and the batteries. It's about the people and making sure you have the right policies in place. Are you evacuating people by quadrants, or are you just telling everybody, just, head on out, like it's the Oregon Trail. Everyone just, head on down the same road. I mean, you were just asking for problems. So in implementing it, that's one of the things I tell people to think about all the time is make sure that whatever you are doing, make sure that you are implementing it in a way that really makes sense, and you're not relying on like what some supplier told you or what some piece of equipment is going to do, or relying or expecting someone like Mike, who's got hundreds of properties responsible for, expecting him to handle the media by himself. He can't do that. You have to work collaboratively together. But again, it requires great planning, collaborative training, and effective drills. If you don't have those things, your planning is useless, and I don't care what the equipment is.
Yeah. Well, it was great talking with you, Patrick. Patrick Hardy, again, is the CEO and founder of High Trophy Disaster Management, and you can learn more about what he provides at reversedisaster.com. He has a number of different plans available, from a lower type disaster plan all the way up to a higher grade plan that involves training and maps and everything else. So he could give you all the details at reversedisaster.com. And Patrick, it's always great hearing from you. And I don't know if you're going to any conferences this fall, but if you are, I guess I'll see you at one of those. So.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ben and Mike. Thank you both for having me today. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And everyone out there, just be prepared.
All right. Well, thanks
Absolutely.
everyone.
Be Boy Scouts. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks everyone for watching,
Thank you.
and we'll see everyone back here next week.
Thank you for listening to WCM's Park Update, a production of Woodall's Campground Magazine. Join us for a new show each Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern on Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn for daily news and updates, and subscribe to our news feed on our website at woodallscm.com. Show hosts are Ben Quiggle and Mike Gast. Executive producers Rick Kessler and Alex Burkett. Copyright 2022, G&G Media Group.